Rights, I asked him, the president, whether there was some kind of arrangement where Ukraine would take some action and the hold would be lifted. Without hesitation, President Trump immediately denied such an arrangement existed. Senator Johnson quotes the president as saying, no, and he prefaced it with a different word. No way, I would never do that. Who told you that? Senator Johnson says, I have accurately characterized the president's reaction as adamant, vehement, and angry. Senator Johnson's telephone call with the president wasn't a public event. It was capturing a genuine moment with the president. And he had, at this point in time, on August 31st, he was adamant, vehement, and angry that there was no connections to aid. There were no preconditions.
Yeah, I had my meeting with Senator Johnson where, again, I had made the presumption that I had made to both Mr. Yermak and the email I had sent to Secretary Pompeo. And we were sort of ruminating about what was going on. And Senator Johnson, I believe, said, I'm going to call President Trump, and find out. And then he obviously had that phone call. I wasn't involved in that phone call.
Okay. But you have no reason to disbelieve that wasn't the way it went down, right?
No reason to disbelieve Senator Johnson.
And now that you've had some time since your deposition and you submitted an addendum relating to the Warsaw get-together with Mr. Yermak, as you sit here today, I mean, are we missing a lot of your communications with the president?
I haven't had that many communications with the president, and in fact, a bunch of the call records that I have had access to, just the short period of time on the call indicates I never got through. In other words, I was put on hold for 1 or 2 minutes and the call never connected. So I really can't give you an accurate count of how many conversations. Plus, Mr. Castor, I've had a lot of conversations with the president about completely unrelated matters that have nothing to do with Ukraine.
But you don't think we're missing any material conversations that you have with the president?
I don't recall any material conversations today as I'm sitting here.
Or with Rudy Giuliani?
Yeah, my memory about the conversations with Rudy Giuliani, whether they were direct, whether they were conference calls with Ambassador Volker or Secretary Perry, is really vague without seeing the call logs.
Are there any other key fact witnesses that would help us, get to the bottom of whether there was any link to the aid and the?
Maybe Brian McCormack, the chief of staff for Secretary Perry, who was involved in and out as well.
Okay. Now, the aid was ultimately lifted on September 11th, correct?
I believe that's correct.
Okay. And Senator Johnson, in his letter on page 6, quotes the president on August 31st. Ron, I understand your position. We're reviewing it now, and you'll probably like my final decision. So even on August 31st, and this is before any congressional investigation started, the president was signaling to Senator Johnson that he was going to lift the aid.
Sounds like it, yeah.
Okay. And most of the other witnesses we talked to, whether it's from the Department of Defense or OMB or have told us that all along during this 55-day period, they genuinely believed the hold would be lifted. Was that your feeling, too, at the time?
I didn't know, because every time I asked about the hold, I was never given a straight answer as to why it had been put in place to begin with.
Now, what do you know about the Ukrainians' knowledge of the hold?
Oh, that's very vague. I don't know if the Politico article triggered it. I don't know if they were told by Mr. Giuliani. It would be pure guesswork on my part, speculation. I don't know.
Okay. I mean, during your deposition, you testified that you did not believe the Ukrainians believed were aware of the hold until the Politico article.
Yeah. Again, I think I testified that I was not clear on the exact dates of when when the light went on. There were a lot of conversations going on with the Ukrainians by a lot of people, so I don't know who communicated what to them.
We have testimony from several witnesses that the president was concerned about foreign aid generally, and so he had an appetite to put holds on aid because he was trying to be a good steward of U.S. taxpayer dollars. Do you agree with that?
I'm aware that that's been his position on aid in other matters, yes.
And are you aware that he was also interested in better understanding the contributions of our European allies?
That I'm definitely aware of.
And there was some back and forth between the State Department officials trying to better understand that information for the president?
Yes, that's correct.
And how do you know that wasn't the reason for the hold?
I don't.
But yet you speculate that there was, a link to this announcement.
I presumed it, yes.
Okay. I want to turn quickly to the July 10th meeting. The July 10th meeting in Ambassador Bolton's office involving Ambassador Volker, Mr. Daniluk, Mr. Yarmak, has been the subject of some controversy. Ambassador Volker yesterday testified that it wasn't until the end of the meeting, Mr. Daniluk, he said, was going through some real detailed information about some of the plans he had. But it wasn't until the end of the meeting, Ambassador Volker recollects that you mentioned something general about investigations. What do you remember from that meeting?
Well, again, I'm not going to dispute Ambassador Volker's recollection, particularly if he had notes. I know that the desire to have the 2016 election DNC server and Burisma were already being discussed by then. Again, I had no direct contact with Mr. Giuliani on July 10th, but through Ambassador Volker. And I probably mentioned that this needs to happen in order to move the process forward. That seemed to be the conventional wisdom at the time. I don't recall any abrupt ending of the meeting or people storming out or anything like that. That would have been very memorable if someone had stormed out of a meeting based on something I said.
Okay, and nobody accused you at that point in time of being involved with some sort of drug deal?
No.
Did Dr. Hill ever relate to you her concerns about you being involved in a drug deal?
Never.
Okay. So you were surprised when testimony emerged that she thought there was a drug deal going on?
I was shocked.
Okay. And in fact, after the meeting, you went out and you took a picture, right?
Yeah, Ambassador Bolton or his assistant indicated that he was out of time, that he had another meeting to attend, and we all walked out of the White House. Everyone was smiling, everyone was happy, and we took a picture on the lawn on a nice sunny day.
Okay. Then did you retire to the wardroom?
I think Secretary Perry asked to use the wardroom to continue the conversation, and the real subject that was under debate, and it wasn't a angry debate, it was a debate, is should the call from President Trump to President Zelensky be made prior to the parliamentary elections in Ukraine or after the parliamentary elections? And there was good reason for both. We felt, Ambassador Perry, Ambassador Volker, and I thought it would help President Zelensky to have President Trump speak to him prior to the parliamentary elections, because it would give President Zelensky more credibility, and ultimately he would do better with his people in the parliamentary elections. Others, I believe, pushed back and said, no, it's not appropriate to do it before, it should be done after. And ultimately it was done after.
Okay. There was no mention of Vice President Biden in the wardroom?
Not that I remember, no.
Or any specific investigation?
Just the generic investigations.
Okay.
Yeah.
When again did the Vice President Biden nexus come to your attention?
Very late. Again, I can't recall the exact date the light bulb went on. It could have been as late as once the transcript was out, but it was always Burisma to me, and I didn't know about the connection between Burisma and Biden.
And to the best of your knowledge, you never understood that anyone was asking Ukrainians to investigate U.S. persons, correct?
Ukrainians to investigate U.S. persons?
Right.
No.
Okay.
No.
And just to sort of be clear here, ultimately the aid was lifted on September 11th. There was never any announcement by the Ukrainians about any investigations they were going to do, correct?
Correct.
The Ukrainians never, to your knowledge, started any of these investigations, correct?
Not to my knowledge.
Consequently, these allegations that there was a quid pro quo that had to be enforced before the aid was released, and it never came to fruition, right?
I don't believe so.
I want to just step back a little bit and just verify with you that the president had some genuinely deep-rooted concerns about corruption in Ukraine, correct?
That's what he expressed to us, yes.
Okay, and you believed him, right, given his business dealings in the region?
When we had the conversation, I did.
And when you first started discussing the concerns the president had with corruption, Burisma wasn't the only company that was mentioned, right?
It was a generic, as I think I testified to Chairman Schiff, it was a generic corruption, oligarchs, just bad stuff going on in Ukraine.
But other companies came up, didn't they?
I don't know if they were mentioned specifically. It might have been Naftagaz because we were working on another issue with Naftagaz, so that might have been one of them.
At one point in your deposition, I believe you said, yeah, Naftagaz comes up at every conversation. Is that fair?
Probably.
Okay. You had, I guess Dr. Hill at one point attributed to you the terminology that the president has given you a large remit. You familiar with her assertion of that?
I didn't understand what she was talking about.
Okay. But you have, and we got into this a little bit in your deposition, you know, you said that the president gave you a special assignment with regard to Ukraine, correct?
Well, when the president appointed me to as the U.S. ambassador to the European Union, Ukraine was part of my portfolio. What made my assignment larger than just being part of my portfolio were the unique circumstances where there was no current sitting ambassador in Ukraine, and there was a new president in Ukraine. And the discussions that we had, the three amigos, Perry, Volker, and I, was that Ukraine needed extraordinary, as high a level support as it could get from the United States during this period, which we cleared with both Ambassador Bolton and with Chief of Staff Mulvaney to continue working on it. So by extension, yes, if the National Security Advisor and the Chief of Staff approve your remit, it really is coming from the president.
Okay. When we asked you that at the deposition, you said I was spinning a little bit.
I was spinning about something else, I think, in the interview in Kiev.
Okay. And you further testified, so when I said the president gave me an assignment, it wasn't really the president, it was the secretary through the president. And that's where I received my direction, correct?
Correct.
Okay. Did Ambassador Taylor ever bring any concerns to your attention about the so-called, the channel he dubbed Irregular?
No, in fact, the opposite. When he came to post, I know I called him, or he called me. I think he spoke with Secretary Perry and Ambassador Volker separately. And in the course of the first few weeks, he was highly appreciative that a new ambassador coming to post like himself was getting the kind of support he was getting from all three of us. Having a cabinet member, a special envoy, and a fellow ambassador all helping to raise the profile of Ukraine. He was highly appreciative and highly complimentary.
And you maintained an open line with him, correct?
Correct. I think there are a number of texts, some of which I have and some of which I don't, where he is reaching out constantly to me and to the others for advice and help.
Okay, we had, I think, tried to count them up. There's 215 or something text messages between you, Volker, and Ambassador Taylor, during the early August timeframe. Does that make sense to you? Is that?
Yeah, I think Taylor started in late June or early July was when he first took post, and I think we began communicating fairly shortly thereafter.
Okay, and he never communicated any concerns to you during this time frame that he had issues with what was going on?
What do you mean by what was going on?
This request for some sort of investigation.
Not in the early stages. He, as time went on, his emails began to be a little more pointed and frantic. And that's when we had very little visibility as to what was going on either. I think it had to do more with the aid and as to why the aid was suspended.
Right. And ultimately you put a period on that issue by having the September 9th communication with the president, correct?
That's correct.
And when you shared that feedback with Ambassador Taylor, was he satisfied that this issue is now behind him?
I don't really know, because he responded when I said, get a hold of the secretary. He said, I agree, and I never knew whether he reached out to the secretary or not. Okay. That was sort of the end of that.
At one point in your text, you said, let's get on the phone, right? And you said you're an individual that doesn't like to walk through these issues on text when you can talk about it on the telephone, correct?
I say that to everybody when something becomes more substantive than just a few lines of text. I say, let's talk.
Okay. And did you talk with Ambassador Taylor?
I don't recall. Okay. I mean, I don't recall whether we spoke right after that, whether he called the secretary. I basically, Mr. Castor, wanted to get the notion across that I've gone as far as I can go with this. You need to pick up the ball. You're the ambassador. You need to pick up the ball and run with it at this point.
Okay. Just getting back to the irregular channel, did anyone else express any concerns to you about this so-called irregular channel?
I'm not sure how someone could characterize something as an irregular channel when you're talking to the President of the United States, the Secretary of State, the National Security Advisor, the Chief of Staff of the White House, the Secretary of Energy. I don't know how that's irregular. If a bunch of folks that are not in that channel are aggrieved for some reason for not being included, I don't know how they can consider us to be the irregular channel and they to be the regular channel when it's the leadership that makes the decisions.
And so the concerns, raised were never brought to a head.
Well, they were never raised.
Okay.
They were never raised. No one said, back off of Ukraine, this is dangerous, you're doing something that's untoward, we have concerns, there was a bad phone call on July 25th, there's talk about a drug cocktail or something. No one ever said that to me, by phone, by text, by email. I don't remember anybody sounding any alarm bell, because of course, had someone mentioned it, I would have sat up and taken notice. Everyone's hair was on fire, but no one decided to talk to us.
When you talk in your statement about in the absence of any credible explanation for the suspension of aid, I later came to believe, it was your speculation, it was your guess, that the resumption of security aid would not occur until there was a public statement from Ukraine committing to the investigations of 2016. And I believe you said that at this point, you believed everyone knew this. Is that correct?
I think once that Politico article broke, it started making the rounds that, if you can't get a White House meeting without the statement, what makes you think you're going to get a, $400 million check? Again, that was my presumption.
Okay. But you had no evidence to prove that, correct?
That's correct.
You stated that you haven't been able to access your records. Is that correct?
Not all of them. And there are lots of notes, records, readouts of calls. Can't get to them.
But you've also stated that you don't take notes, right?
I don't take notes, but there are a lot of others out there.
And you freely admit that You know, when last I asked at your deposition, we put together a list of all the times you said you don't recall. It's like 2 pages long. So
Is that all?
So, you know, you don't, on a lot of these questions, I mean, there's nuance, there are ambiguities, and we don't have records, we don't have notes, and we don't have recollections, correct?
Right. I mean, it's situational things that sort of trigger memory, especially when I'm dealing with the European Union, I'm dealing with the 28 member countries, I'm dealing with other countries that are not in the European Union that are part of my mandate, I'm dealing with the White House leadership. There's a lot of stuff to juggle. And as I said in my opening statement, a phone call for me with the President of the United States or the President of fill-in-the-blank country, while people who get a call like that maybe once in a lifetime, a call like that might be very memorable. They might remember every single thing about it. I'm doing that all day long, and I'm not saying it in a way of being braggadocio or anything like that, but it's part of my routine day. So all of these calls, these meetings with very important people tend to sort of blend together until I have someone that can show me what we discussed, what the subject was, then all of a sudden it comes back.
I mean, we're trying to get to the facts here. We're trying to find out what actually happened, what's reliable, what's accurate. Bill Taylor kept notes. He brought a little notebook in his pocket at his deposition and he held it up and he says, when I'm not at my desk, I'm on the phone, I use this notebook. When I'm at my desk, I use a notebook. George Kent said he wrote just innumerable memos to the file. Catherine Croft, she testified that she didn't believe George Kent's notes would be accurate. And so, you know, we have all this, you know, back and forth, but, you know, as we get to the end here, you don't have records, you don't have your notes because you didn't take notes. You don't have a lot of recollections. I mean, this is the trifecta of unreliability. Isn't that true?
Well, what I'm trying to do today is to use the limited information I have to be as forthcoming as possible with you and the rest of the committee. And as these recollections have been refreshed by subsequent testimony, by some texts and emails that I've now had access to, I think I filled in a lot of blanks.
But a lot of it's speculation. A lot of it is your guess, and we're talking about, you know, an impeachment of the President of the United States. So the evidence here ought to be pretty darn good.
I've been very clear as to when I was presuming, and I was presuming on the aid. On the other things, Mr. Castor, I did have some texts that I read from. So when it comes to those, I'll rely on those texts because I don't have any reason to believe that those texts were, you know, falsely sent or that there's some subterfuge there. They are what they are. They say what they say.
Okay. Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
Time of the gentleman has expired. We'll now move to a second staff-led round of 30 minutes. Mr. Volker, I just have a few questions before I turn it back to Mr. Goldman. You testified in response to my colleagues in the minority something along the lines of a lot of people did not make the connection between Burisma and Biden. I think a lot of people have real difficulty understanding that. Tim Morrison testified that I think it took him all of doing a Google search to find out, oh, this is the significance of Burisma. It involves the Bidens. Are you saying during all this time up until the call you never made the connection between Burisma and the Bidens? You just thought that the president and Rudy Giuliani were interested in this one particular Ukrainian company?
Again, my role, Mr. Chairman, was just to get the meeting.
Well, I understand that, but my question is, are you saying that for months and months, notwithstanding everything Rudy Giuliani was saying on TV and all the discussion with Rudy Giuliani, that you never put Burisma together with the Bidens?
I didn't, and I wasn't paying attention to what Mr. Giuliani was saying on TV. We were talking to him directly.
Let me ask you this. Ambassador Volker testified yesterday to a similar epiphany, for lack of a better word. This is what he said. In hindsight, I now understand that others saw the idea of investigating possible corruption involving the Ukrainian company Burisma as equivalent to investigating former Vice President Biden. I saw them very different, the former being appropriate and unremarkable, the latter being unacceptable. In retrospect, I should have seen that connection differently, and had I done so, I would have raised my own objections. Does that sum up your views as well?
It does.
Now, I think you were asked a question with a bit of a incorrect premise by my colleagues in the minority about Fiona Hill saying that, referring to a drug deal between you and Mr. Mulvaney. It was Ambassador Bolton who made the comment that he didn't want to be part of any drug deal that Ambassador Sondland and Mulvaney were cooking up. No one thinks they're talking about a literal drug deal here or a drug cocktail. The import, I think, of the ambassador's comments is quite clear, that he believed that this bargain, this quid pro quo, as you've described it, over a meeting, the investigations to get the meeting was not something he wanted to be a part of. What I want to ask you about is, he makes reference in that drug deal to a drug deal cooked up by you and Mulvaney. It's the reference to Mulvaney that I want to ask you about. You've testified that Mulvaney was aware of this quid pro quo, of this condition that the Ukrainians had to meet, that is, announcing these public investigations to get the White House meeting. Is that right?
Yeah, a lot of people were aware of it, and
including Mr. Mulvaney.
Correct.
And including the Secretary of State.
Correct.
Now, have you seen the acting Chief of Staff's press conference in which he acknowledged that the military aid was withheld in part because of a desire to get that 2016 investigation you've talked about?
I don't think I saw it live. I saw it later. Yeah.
So you saw him acknowledge publicly what you have confirmed too, that Mr. Mulvaney understood that 2 + 2 = 4. Is that right?
Well, again, I didn't know that the aid was conclusively tied. I was presuming he was in a position to say yes it was or no it wasn't, because
and he said yes it was, did he not?
He said yes it was.
Mr. Goldman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you again, Ambassador Sondland. We do appreciate your efforts to refresh your recollection through the documents, and we understand, we share your frustration in not having the documents to help guide this investigation. So we do appreciate those efforts. One of the documents that you provided to us goes back to the conversation you and the chairman were having about Mr. Mulvaney. And you had been trying for some time before the July 25th call to set up that call. Is that right?
To set up the call between President Trump and President Zelensky, yes.
Correct, yes. And I want to show you an email that you reference in your opening statement. That is a July 19th email. And who is this from?
It looks like is it from me? I don't know.
It's from you, I believe.
That's from me to the group.
Now, who is the group?
People mentioned on the email: Blair, Kenna, McCormack, Mulvaney, Perry, Pompeo.
And who's Robert Blair?
I believe he's a deputy chief of staff or a advisor to the chief of staff.
And you've already told us that Lisa Kenna is the executive secretary for Secretary Pompeo. Who's Brian McCormack?
The chief of staff he was the chief of staff for Secretary Perry.
And then we see Mr. Mulvaney, Secretary Perry, and Secretary Pompeo. Can you read what you wrote on July 19th to this group, please?
He is prepared to receive POTUS call, will assure him that he intends to run a fully transparent investigation, will turn over every stone. He would greatly appreciate a call prior to Sunday so he can put out some media about a friendly and productive call, no details, prior to Ukraine election on Sunday.
So Sunday was the 21st, which was the date of the parliamentary elections in Ukraine, is that right?
That's right.
When you say will assure him that he intends to run a fully transparent investigation and will, quote, turn over every stone, unquote, what do you mean there?
I'm referring to the Burisma and the 2016/DNC server investigations.
Later that evening, Secretary Perry responds just to you and Brian McCormick, saying Mick just confirmed the call being set up for tomorrow by NSC RP. And then a little later, Mr. Mulvaney replies to all, saying, I asked NSC to set it up for tomorrow. Were these the only responses that you received to this email?
I don't know. If I have them, I would show them. I don't know.
No one wrote back to you and said, what are you talking about in terms of these investigations and turning over every stone?
No, there was a chain, and I don't know if it's part of this email or a subsequent email, where I believe Ambassador Bolton pushed back and said he did not want a call to President Zelensky made by President Trump until after the parliamentary elections.
So that would explain why it was moved from the next day, July 20th, to the 25th, right?
That's right.
But Ambassador Bolton is not on this email, is he?
I don't think he is, no.
Now, you were asked by Mr. Castor if there are any other key witnesses who might be able to help with our investigation. And you mentioned Brian McCormick, right, the Chief of Staff for Secretary Perry?
I did.
You are aware that the committee subpoenaed him, are you not?
I wasn't aware of that.
And that he refused to come testify? Are you also aware that Mr. Mulvaney was subpoenaed by the committee and refused to come testify?
I did read that in the newspaper, yes.
Are you also aware that Robert Blair was subpoenaed and refused to come testify?
I think I'm aware of that.
And that Secretary Perry was asked to come testify and refused?
I am aware of that as well.
So would you include them, as well as Secretary Pompeo, as key witnesses that would be able to provide some additional information on this inquiry?
I think they would.
Now, this was not the first time, as you indicated, that Mr. Mulvaney heard about these investigations into Burisma and the 2016 election. Is that right?
I don't know what Mr. Mulvaney heard or didn't hear. I think there's been a huge amount of exaggeration over my contact with Mr. Mulvaney. It was actually quite limited.
Well, he certainly he certainly indicated a familiarity with what you were talking about in this July 19th email. Is that right?
Because I think Mr. Mulvaney was in the May 23rd briefing with President Trump. I don't remember because there were people sitting behind us that were coming and going when we were sitting in front of President Trump's desk.
Okay. Now, you've said that you don't have a recollection of referencing Mulvaney in the July 10th meeting in Ambassador Bolton's office. Is that right? Or
I don't recall.
So when both Fiona Hill and Colonel Vindman testify that in response to a question from Ukrainian officials at that July 10th meeting about scheduling a White House visit, that you said, well, I spoke with Mr. Mulvaney and it will be scheduled after they announce these investigations. Do you have any reason to dispute that characterization?
I don't have any reason to agree or dispute. I just don't remember.
So if they both remembered it and they both then went and spoke to the NSC legal advisor about it, you would trust that whatever they relayed to the NSC legal advisor would likely be an accurate reflection?
Again, I trust that they related to the NSC legal advisor. I don't know whether I said it, and I don't know which conversation. Again, I've had very, very limited conversations with Mr. Mulvaney.
This email indicates that you spoke to President Zelensky and were relaying what he said to very senior officials. Is that right?
Which email again?
Sorry, the July 19th email, where you say, the subject is, I talked to Zelensky just now.
I've got it.
Was there some sort of assurance that President Zelensky needed to provide about what he would say to President Trump in order just to get the phone call?
I think that part was verbal, and then there were a lot of communications going around back and forth with the Ukrainians, and that's when someone, and I don't remember who, came up with the idea of a draft statement, so there would be no misunderstanding about what, in fact, the Ukrainians would say and would be willing to say, that we could rely on and negotiate something on a piece of paper.
So just to place you in time, we're going to get to that draft statement, which was in August. This is July 19th, before the July 25th call. Do you remember whether there was a need from any of the White House officials or other national security officials for President Zelensky to provide some assurance of what he would say to President Trump before a phone call, not the meeting, but a phone call was scheduled?
There was initially apparently a condition, but that condition was obviously dropped because the phone call took place and there was no such statement made. The phone call took place, as you said, on the 25th of July.
And when you say there was no such statement that took place, what do you mean?
Well, the Ukrainians never made their public statement prior to the phone call on the 25th of July.
Right, but we're not talking about a public statement. What I was asking is whether President Zelensky needed to relay to you or the other American officials that he would assure President Trump that he would do these investigations in a phone call.
In my email, I obviously had just spoken with him, and he being Zelensky, and he said that he was prepared to receive the call and he would make those assurances to President Trump on that call, and then presumably that would then lead to the White House meeting.
And you had been discussing this phone call for several weeks now, is that right?
Yes, I think with Volker, with Perry, with Giuliani through Volker and Perry.
And then right after you sent this email assuring the others that he will discuss the investigations and will turn over every stone, the Burisma and 2016 election investigations, Mr. Mulvaney responded that he asked to set up the call for the next day. Is that right?
That's what it says.
Now, let's go to that press statement that you were discussing in August. And you testified, I believe, that you understood that Rudy Giuliani was representing the president's interests with regard to Ukraine. Is that right?
That's what we all understood.
And when you all, who do you mean we all?
Secretary Perry, Ambassador Volker, myself.
In August, you and Ambassador Volker were coordinating with Andrei Yermak, the Zelensky aide, about a press statement. And I want to pull up some of the text exchanges that you were referring to, which, as you acknowledge, helps you refresh your recollection. Is that right?
And I think Taylor was involved in those initial discussions as well.
Well, he's not on any of these text messages, so perhaps he was. He does not remember that. But let's go to the first one. Is it working? On August 9th. There's an exchange between Ambassador Volker and you where you are discussing setting up, we'll try to bring it up in a second, but I'll just summarize for you. You're discussing trying to set up a White House meeting. Here it is. And you say Morrison ready to get dates as soon as Yermak confirms. Mr. Volker, or Ambassador Volker says, excellent. How did you sway him? You said, not sure I did. I think POTUS really wants the deliverable. What did you mean there?
The commitment to do the investigations.
And how did you know that the president wanted the deliverable?
I don't recall. I may have had a conversation with him, or I may have heard it from someone else, but I don't recall, again, without all these records.
Going to the next exhibit, Exhibit 10, where, or August 10th, rather. This is between you and Andrei Yermak. What did you say initially in this exchange?
Hello? Good? Oh, no, that's Yermak. How was your conversation?
And Mr. Yermak responds, hello, good. My proposal, we receive date, and then we make general statement with discussed things. Once we have a date, we'll call for a press briefing announcing upcoming visit and outlining vision for the reboot of U.S.-Ukraine relationship, including, among other things, Burisma and election meddling and investigations. And you respond, got it. That was your understanding of what this statement had to say to satisfy Mr. Giuliani, is that right?
Yes.
And then ultimately to satisfy the POTUS deliverable?
Yes.
Now, the next day you write an email to Ulrich Breckbull and Lisa Kenna. Are you able to see that on your
Yeah, I can see it on
screen?
the screen, yeah.
Okay. What is the subject of the email?
Ukraine.
And can you read what you wrote there?
Mike, and I'm referring to Secretary Pompeo, Kurt and I negotiated a statement from Zelensky to be delivered for our review in a day or two. The contents will hopefully make the boss happy enough to authorize an invitation. Zelensky plans to have a big presser on the openness subject, including specifics next week.
And in your opening statement, you said that the specifics, what did the specifics represent?
The 2016 and the Burisma,
And when you say the boss, who do you mean by that?
President Trump,
And the invitation is what?
to the White House meeting.
And Lisa Kenner responds, Gordon, I'll pass to S, and S is Secretary Pompeo?
Correct.
Thank you, Lisa. Now, 2 days later, you have a text exchange with Ambassador Volker again. And this is at the end of it, but the earlier text, which we don't have here, you may recall, includes the press statement, the revised press statement that includes Burisma and the 2016 election. Do you recall that?
Yes, if I could see it, that would be helpful, but yes.
But you ultimately remembered that after your conversation with Mr. Giuliani, you did pass along a statement to the Ukrainians that included Burisma in the 2016 election. Is that right?
I think there were statements being passed back and forth between Volker, the Ukrainians, and others to try and negotiate acceptable language.
Mm-hmm. And ultimately, that statement was not issued, was it?
Correct.
And the White House meeting did not.
Still hasn't occurred.
Still hasn't occurred. But you certainly understood at that time, did you not, that it was the president's direction and instruction that a White House meeting with President Zelensky would not occur until President Zelensky announced publicly the investigations that the president wanted. Is that right?
That's correct.
And you now know that the investigations the president wanted was an investigation into the Bidens and an investigation into the 2016 election.
I know that now, yes.
I'm going to move ahead to August 22nd. And you wrote an email to Secretary Pompeo, directly to Secretary Pompeo, CCing Lisa Kenna, with the subject of Zelensky. And could you please read what you wrote to Secretary Pompeo?
Mike, should we block time in Warsaw for a short pull-aside for POTUS to meet Zelensky? I would ask Zelensky to look him in the eye and tell him that once Ukraine's new justice folks are in place mid-September, Zelensky should be able to move forward publicly and with confidence on those issues of importance to POTUS and to the U.S. Hopefully that will break the logjam.
And Secretary Pompeo responds to you 3 minutes later, yes. Now, I want to unpack this a little bit. You said that in the middle, once Ukraine's new justice folks are in place. What did you mean by that?
The new prosecutor that was going to be working for President Zelensky, the old prosecutor, I believe his term was up or he was being let go. He was the Poroshenko prosecutor, and Zelensky wanted to wait until his person was in place.
So once that new prosecutor was in place, then President Zelensky, should be able to move forward publicly and with confidence on those issues of importance to POTUS. What did you mean by those issues of importance to POTUS?
Again, the 2016 election and Burisma investigation.
Were you aware at this time that Secretary Pompeo had listened in to the July 25th phone call?
I was not.
If he had, do you believe that he would fully understand what the issues of importance to POTUS related to Ukraine would be?
I mean, I can't characterize his state of mind. He listened in on the phone call and he concluded what he concluded.
But now that you've read the phone call, it's quite clear what the issues of importance to POTUS are.
Yes,
Biden investigation and
Yes.
the 2016 election investigation. Is that right?
that's correct.
Then it says, hopefully, that will break the logjam. Now, by this point, you were aware that security assistance had been on hold for about 5 weeks. Is that right?
I became aware on the 18th of July.
And you understood that there was a lot of activity within the State Department and elsewhere to try to get that hold lifted. Is that right?
That's right.
Just about everybody in the interagency, meaning the national security apparatus, wanted to lift the hold and wanted the aid to go to Ukraine?
Correct.
So what did you mean here when you said logjam?
Well, as I said to Chairman Schiff, I meant inclusively anything that was holding up moving forward on the meeting and the Ukraine-U.S. relationship.
And what was holding that up?
At that point, it was the statements about Burisma and the 2000, exactly when his trip was, but I thought it was kind of an odd request, given that the White House can pretty much get anyone's phone number they want.
Now, in this email to Secretary Pompeo, you referenced a trip to Warsaw. Ultimately, the vice president went on that trip?
That's correct.
And that was the conversation that you talked about, you testified earlier to, that where you said that we really need to get these investigations from Ukraine in order to release the aid in the pre-meeting?
That's right.
And Vice President Pence just nodded?
He heard what I said.
And didn't respond in any way?
I don't recall any substantive response.
But you never specifically referenced the